So I like to start. I like to start by because I believe this is the closing public event of the JapanPrize week. So we've been both Professor Dupuy and I have been through a lot of events through the week. So I'd like to start by thanking and congratulating all of the staff of the JapanPrize Foundation for hospitality and for a superb and very precise organization of events. So thank you and congratulations. And of course, thanking again the foundation and the selection committees for awarding the JapanPrize on ecology and environment to myself. And I'm not really going to talk much about how this work was developed, but more looking into the future, because we are facing a time where we need to move fast and address a number of challenges. So I'll spend a little bit of time framing the conversation, but mostly looking into the future of our interaction with nature. And that is important because today we have lost about 2/3 of the abundance of plants and animals that populated the planet only 50 years ago. So that is a loss of natural capital upon which our well-being depends, and that loss unfortunately continues. And this is the infrastructure upon which our life in Earth depends, and that is called natural capital, that I would like to introduce as a term. And natural capital refers to the components of ecosystems that might be species like bees, or might be a consortium of species, or might be ecosystems that support the processes upon which the benefits that nature provides to humanity relies. So it's really a fundamental underpinning of our well-being, and we give it for granted. But after we've lost 2/3 of this abundance, we can no longer give these services for granted, and they no longer come for free. And this is true on land, but on oceans we have also lost about half. These are different plots of the loss rates of different species and communities of marine animals, and we have lost roughly about half of the natural capital of the oceans that were once believed to be inexhaustible due to human extraction, but we have definitely lost about half of the natural capital. In some cases, like sharks and great whales, we have lost about 90% of the abundance of these animals that populated the planet around the end of World War II. Why this happened, it involves multiple factors, but basically 4 forces that have been operating for a long time. First, hunting is the earliest form of extraction of marine life, and it reached a peak around 1990, and then it was started to be first downsized because the abundance of animals to be hunted disappeared. And for instance, the stellar cow, which was a very large dugong-like animal that was found by Dutch sailors in the 1700s. It was a very large animal of about 10 meters long, looking like a manatee or a dugong, and it was driven by extinction by hunting in only 30 years, and very carefully documented. So animals were being hunted down to extinction, therefore there was fewer animals to hunt. But then we started to fish also the oceans, and fishing reached a maximum yield in around 1990, and it has declined since, also because of the depletion of the stocks, but also through regulation. Deforestation is also a force that has impacted on marine life, because deforestation leads to an excess flow of sediments to the coastal water. And I've, for instance, been working in the Philippines in coral reefs that had been recently buried by meters of silt derived by runoff of forests that had been logged recently in the Philippines. Then habitat loss due to either logging or conversion of habitats into other uses has been also a major force of loss of marine life. And more recently, fertilizers, pollutants in all forms, chemical pollutants like industrial fertilizer, plastic, synthetic chemicals, have been also a major force driven the decline of marine life. And lastly, climate change, which started to become apparent in terms of measurable changes on the ocean and responses of marine organisms around 1980, 1990, right now represent probably the primary driver of loss of marine life. So as we became aware of the impacts of our actions on the oceans and marine life, different policies were put in place to try to mitigate these impacts. And for instance, the moratorium on whaling from the International Whaling Commission in 1982 has actually enabled great whales to recover across much of the ocean at different rates. But for instance, when the moratorium was established in 1982, the abundance of humpback whales was about 300 animals left in the ocean. And every marine biologist at the time thought that these animals were earmarked for extinction. But as the outcome of the moratorium, now there are about 60,000 humpback whales in the oceans. They continue to grow, but we assess that they have already been brought back to the baseline around 1950. So it is possible through these policies and actions to enable the recovery of marine life. And also the CITES Convention, that is the international convention that regulates the trade of endangered species, has also relaxed and released the pressures on many of these marine animals and been fundamental in enabling the recovery of many of these species. And then we have also different UN conventions, like the Convention for Biological Diversity, that aims at stopping biodiversity losses and recovering some of the losses, and also the UN Framework Climate Change Convention that aims at avoiding dangerous climate change, although unfortunately we're failing to meet that goal. But at least there's an awareness and a global action to try to mitigate this impact. So basically we can summarize these 2 centuries more or less of strong human pressure on the oceans in 3 acts. One is an epoch from the Industrial Revolution to around 1990 of a sharp increase in pressures and very rapid decline in marine life. Around the 1990s, with the establishment of these policies, then we can enter a phase where pressures were starting to be released. And then we have now the opportunity to rebuild the abundance of marine life, not just slow down losses, but start to bend the curve and rebuild the abundance of marine life. So my colleagues and I, and Professor Susana Agustí is my wife and collaborator. She was the second author of this paper published in the journal Nature in 2020, where we provide the scientific evidence that it is possible to recover the abundance of marine life to a substantial degree, about 70 to 80% of the past abundance, historical abundance, within a time frame of 30 years, which is about 1 human generation. So if we take action now, and we've already been 5 years into the discussion, then we might aim to endow our grandchildren and children with an ocean that is once again abundant of marine life. And basically there are 6 levers to achieve this recovery of the oceans, and 1 prerequisite. So the levers are protect species through some of the policies that we've seen already, harvest wisely so we don't deplete fish stocks and animals upon which we also depend for food, protect spaces in the ocean, restore marine ecosystems actively, mitigate climate change, and mitigate pollution. And the prerequisite is we don't give up in the hope that we can once again rebuild the ocean to a state of abundance and have that legacy to our children and the unborn. So about 2 years after we published this paper, these recommendations were adopted in a new policy, which is the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, that set the goals for biodiversity for the current decade. It was supposed to take place in 2020, but due to COVID, then the summit could not take place. And in fact, it couldn't be organized in the Chinese city of Kunming, so it was organized in Montreal, where the headquarters of the Convention on Biological Diversity takes place. So there were a number of important commitments achieved in this framework, and basically is to stop biodiversity losses by 2030, to protect 30% of land and oceans by 2030, and to restore 30% of degraded habitats by 2030. And one of the components of this strategy invoke calling upon nations to activate what is referred to as nature-based solutions to climate change, because of the benefits that these solutions, that I will explain later what they are about, bring about in terms of achieving the biodiversity goals. So there was already establishment of a link between biodiversity and climate goals, and these were made more explicit later on. And we published a paper in the journal Science 2 years ago where we mapped the links between climate and biodiversity action. So the Paris Agreement, which is the goals, the climate goals that have united the world, except a few countries. This year again, the US departed the Paris Agreement for the second time, but most other countries are engaged with these goals. Commits to contain global warming within 1.5 to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and eventually meet a balance between emissions of greenhouse gases and sinks of greenhouse gases by mid-century, by 2050. And the Commemorative Biodiversity Goal framework then aims also at contributing to these goals by activating nature-based solutions. So the link between these two is natural capital, and I'm going to focus on blue natural capital because there's been already awareness of the role of contributing to climate action by managing forest for a long time, but the focus on the oceans is relatively recent and lags about 30 years compared to that on land. So in 2020, my colleague and friend Bill McDonough and I were tasked with presenting a framework to achieve the goals of the UNFCCC in the context of the G20. And we proposed a concept called circular carbon economy that was then adopted by the G20 nations in the Leaders' Declaration at the end of the year, and maps the use of materials by humans that eventually leads to the release of greenhouse gases through two spheres. One is the biosphere. The biosphere is the universe of biological organisms, species, and so on that are in the planet. Everybody knows what the biosphere is. But the next circle, the blue circle here, is the technosphere. And the technosphere is the universe of human-built objects. And there was a very important milestone in 2019 when it was calculated that the mass of the technosphere exceeded for the first time the mass of the biosphere. So the size of the mass of buildings and other objects built by humans was actually larger than the mass of forest and the mass of fish in the ocean and living organisms. So the technosphere is also a good place where we can store carbon, and there are different elements that we can put in place to achieve our goals, to achieve a balance between emissions of greenhouse gases and removal of greenhouse gases. So obviously we need to reduce emissions by using renewable energy sources, but also increasing energy efficient. And we saw how, for instance, the transition to LEDs and eventually laser-based illumination can really reduce greatly the energy used to provide lighting systems. We also need to reuse, trap, reuse, and recycle, for instance, carbon dioxide. And now there are many applications that are coming online to use carbon dioxide as a material in many different products, from concrete to new polymers. So rather than allow carbon dioxide to be released in the atmosphere, it can be used as a material. But we already have excess amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And in fact, unfortunately, we already reached the 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels of warming that were projected to be reached by 2035. We reached them by 2023. So we're already in that danger zone that the UN Framework Climate Change Convention assesses to be the threshold beyond which the impacts on society of climate change are going to challenge our capacity to maintain prosperous societies. So we're already there. So we need to remove excess greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. And we can do that in the technosphere by using machines that remove carbon dioxide, or even new technologies that develop new concretes that are absorb carbon passively or actively carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Or we can actually remove carbon dioxide in the biosphere. And that is a technology that is well proven because it basically relies on photosynthesis that has about 3,500 million years of track record. So let me then focus on the nature-based solutions. And nature-based solutions are an approach to remove excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by managing ecosystems, both on land and ocean. So there's a whale there because they too contribute to remove carbon dioxide. And we define nature-based solutions as an approach to decarbonize the atmosphere, so to remove carbon dioxide that was released in the atmosphere by recarbonizing the biosphere. That means that the outcome of nature-based solutions is to increase the stock of living nature and actually rebuild natural capital. So when you use technology fixes to remove carbon dioxide, oftentimes then you end up with carbon dioxide in a concentrated form, but you need to do something with it, or else it might be leaked back to the atmosphere. But we know what the outcome of the nature-based solutions is, which is organic carbon that is stored in living organisms or soils or other repositories. So we're going to focus now on nature-based solutions because when in the public discourse, when climate change is discussed, climate change is often equated to burning of fossil fuels, but this is only a component of climate change, and historically a component that is referred in carbon accounting as land use change, which is a very unfortunate term because this is not just about land use, it's also about ocean impacts, but that refers to the destruction and the degradation of ecosystems by humans contributed 38% of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. So about 1/3 of the problem, more than 1/3 of the problem, comes from the destruction of ecosystems, the loss of natural capital on land, but also on oceans. And still today, the land use change, or the destruction of ecosystems, is responsible for about 24% of annual emissions of greenhouse gases. So it follows that the scope to contribute to climate action and achieve our climate goals by activating nature-based solutions is about 1/3 of the problem. Now, as I mentioned earlier, nature-based solutions were considered, and the initial focus was managing forest on land, like the Amazon degradation and other forest areas in Indonesia and elsewhere. But I was doing research in the 1990s that showed that the marine ecosystems that are in the fringing of the continents, in the coastal area, are the most intense carbon sinks in the oceans. We published our first paper in 1996 that demonstrated this very strong carbon sink capacity, and then we consolidated the results further by showing that this carbon was being accumulated in the soils of these ecosystems in 2005. So we documented that the long-term carbon burial in the sediments of these coastal habitats, which are mangroves, seagrasses, kelp forests, and also salt and seagrass meadows, is about 10 times larger than that in terrestrial forest. And if we compare the champion of carbon removal on land, which will be the pristine Amazonian forest, with the champion of carbon removal in the ocean, which will be a Mediterranean seagrass meadow, then a hectare of a Mediterranean seagrass meadow that you can see on the right part of the photograph is equivalent to 17 hectares of Amazonian forest in terms of the annual carbon removal capacity. And yet these ecosystems have been overlooked and they were being destroyed without being aware of the impacts of destroying these ecosystems, not just for climate regulation, but also for coastal protection and food security from fisheries. So realizing this important role, and you can see that a seagrass meadow in the Mediterranean doesn't look like much compared to the Amazonian forest. So I was intrigued in how did it came about that these ecosystems have such intense capacity to remove carbon. So over a decade or so, I was busy looking at the different mechanisms. So that kind of summarizes the outcome of about a decade of work that showed that there are about 5 reasons why they perform such an intense role as carbon sinks. One is that they're highly productive. That was relatively well known, that they're very, very productive, and many times the production of a cornfield in these ecosystems. But they also help dissipate energy through their canopies and root systems. So they dissipate the energy of waves and currents, and in doing so, they encourage the deposition of particles, and also they prevent the resuspension of the particles even during very strong energy events like tsunamis or storms. So these materials are deposited in these sediments, and they act like a sediment trap. For instance, I published work in 2002 that showed that the seagrass meadow in a Philippine coral reef was actually filtering out all of the particles in the water column of this lagoon twice a day. So it's actually a very effective filter of particles, but also the material that they produce is highly recalcitrant. So that refers that it's very poor in nutrients and therefore very difficult for microbes to break down. So that slows down the composition rates and increases the likelihood that this material will be sequestered in the sediments for the long term. And also in the marine sediments, oxygen disappears just a few millimeters below the surface, and then this anoxic environment is also not conducive to efficient microbial degradation, and it leads to a high preservation of carbon in these soils. And when I was discussing my findings on coastal habitats with people working on forests, there was something that I felt they were not understanding, and it took me a bit of time to realize that the fact that they were not factoring in is that there are no fires underwater. So in a forest, the return time of a fire will be about 100 years typically. Now with climate change, they're happening faster and more frequently. And that means that every 100 years, all of the carbon that is accumulated on the biomass or on soils is burned and released back to the atmosphere. But we don't have fires underwater. So we have actually these materials that deposit in the marine sediments are safely deposited from the impacts of forest fires and even storms. And in the thickest deposits that we've been able to sample, we documented 11 meters of organic matter accrued over 7,000 years. So they really build very large stocks of organic carbon that is safely deposited and removed for thousands of years. And yet, these ecosystems have also been lost at high rates because there was very little appreciation of their value. And in 2009, I nicknamed seagrass meadows, like the one in the upper left corner, as the ugly ducklings of environmental conservation, because at the time, not even the NGOs working on conservation did care about these ecosystems, because they were not found to be very useful or interesting. So we lost about 50% of them across the world, and therefore we lost that capacity to sequester carbon, but also when we lose these ecosystems, then the stock of carbon that is accumulated in the sediments lose the protective cover, and they become amenable to be resuspended, degraded, and emitted again. So realizing the opportunity to contribute to climate action by avoiding further losses of these ecosystems or even restoring these ecosystems, then I worked with different UN agencies in 2009 to produce a report that was called Blue Carbon, the Role of Healthy Oceans in Binding Carbon, where I wrote most of the centerpiece of the report that was based on the functioning of these ecosystems. And this is the first time that the term blue carbon was used. So there was an immediate uptake of this concept because many nations were already embarked in large-scale afforestation of mangroves, not because of the climate benefits, but because of coastal protection. So in 2004, a tsunami in the Indian Ocean then devastated the shorelines of Indonesia, Thailand, India, and Bangladesh, killing 250,000 people. And I was part of the first assessment of the impacts of the tsunami, and then it was very rapidly realized that where a pocket of mangrove was in existence between the towns, the villages, and the ocean, there was almost no losses of coastal of human lives, and the losses of infrastructure were far less than the losses when the protective role of mangroves were absent because they had been locked down. So those countries were already engaged in large-scale afforestation projects, but they were not realizing on the climate benefits of their work. So they immediately adopted blue carbon because they were doing it already. And then in 2015, the first purposed project of significant size was announced in the Philippines, and that was invested by the French government. It was about only 75 million US dollars invested in mangrove restoration that was announced in the Climate Convention in Paris, where the Paris Agreement was launched. So then, since this time, the concept of blue carbon has been gaining uptake, and every 3 years, the investment on blue carbon has been multiplying by a factor of 10. So from very small initial projects of $1 or a few $1 million, now we're seeing investments in the order of several billions per year that are being made in blue carbon projects. And just yesterday, Microsoft announced a very large investment in a blue carbon project in the salt marshes in Louisiana, in the US. So many nations started to develop their own blue carbon programs, and I was involved in many of them. So for instance, I led the first national-wide assessment of blue carbon resources and blue carbon strategies for Australia when I was director of the Oceans Institute in the University of Western Australia. But I have been also involved in the development of the national program in Portugal, US, Colombia, in Saudi Arabia, in Spain, and also with my colleagues in the room in Japan. So Japan developed a roadmap for blue carbon that was presented in COP27, I believe it was, in Sharm el-Sheikh. So that was 2022, I think. And then I was actually invited also to the presentation of this plan. And it's probably the most complete and comprehensive plan in blue carbon in the world. But I'm now working on blue carbon with the government of South Korea and also with Hyundai Motors, announced a very large investment in blue carbon, and I was announced as their global blue carbon ambassador and advisor. And in fact, just today, I would like to thank also not just for this particular piece of information, but for her work through the week, to the escort that I was provided by the JapanPrize Foundation. And then in the transit this morning from the Prime Minister's office to the hotel, she showed me a school book from Japan that the school children are taking in the classroom, and they learn about blue carbon already. I think I was told that the orange sign on the side says blue carbon. So it's already learning material into your schools, and therefore there's a very strong uptake of the concept of blue carbon in Japan, simply because it's also very closely aligned with your culture of stewardship of nature. So fishermen everywhere in the world, they just take fish. Fishermen in Japan traditionally, they dedicate about 2/3 of their time to harvest the oceans, but they dedicate about 1/3 of their time to improving the ocean so it continues to be productive. So restoration of marine habitats is deeply embedded in the culture of Japanese fishermen and Japanese society. So therefore, there is an inclination to restore that is very present in Japan, and it's also now in the school books. So this paper is about to be published, but we have documented and summarized the rise and flow of blue carbon credits globally. This is incomplete because many projects do not report their data, but this is based on projects that are already issuing carbon credits that are reporting the data. So by 2024, there were 81 projects that were already releasing carbon credits The number of blue carbon projects is probably about 10 times this number, but many projects are in development and they have not yet released carbon credits because you need to accumulate a lot of carbon before you can issue a carbon credit. So this is just the tip of the iceberg and represents about 2% of the potential of blue carbon to contribute to climate action, but already receives an investment of $1.6 billion in 2024 in these projects. The total investment is probably 15 times this amount globally on projects that are under different state of development. And they are committed to remove 6 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2075, these 81 projects. And the combined action will expand the area of mangroves by 10%. So this is actually starting to be globally relevant. And whereas blue carbon was a really small sector in the past, now it has exceeded the $1 billion investment per year. So now it's visible to the market, and market players want to play a role in blue carbon. There's also something important in blue carbon that is depicted in the right. So much of the loss of these habitats has occurred in developing nations and have occurred in developing nations due to colonial pressures and commercial pressures from demands from developed nations. So blue carbon actually represents a reverse flow where developed nations are investing in restoring and conserving habitats in developing nations against carbon credits. And whereas the carbon credits flow from developing nations to developed nations, the many benefits that these habitats provide to people, which include coastal protection, food security, improved water quality, aesthetic and tourism opportunities, and many others, cannot be transferred across borders, so they are always with the community. So it actually represents, I believe, a reversal of the damage created by the consumerism of developed nations into developing nations. And in terms of mangroves, we can look at the impact of blue carbon in looking at this figure that depicts the satellite record of the abundance of mangrove in the world. So the first estimate is around 1978, where we have the first estimate based on satellites of the global abundance of mangroves, and there were about 220,000 square kilometers of mangroves, and we can see a very sharp decline of mangroves until about year 2000, and then the losses have slowed down, almost stopped, and now in many regions of the world, mangroves are starting to rebound, mostly because of the impact of blue carbon projects. So we have a timeline to recover, which actually is reasonable and is projecting the current investments in blue carbon into the future. So it is possible that by 2050, we might actually go back to an amount of mangrove in the ocean that will be close to the amount that we had in 1970. This will not be equivalent to the historical abundance of mangroves because we had significant losses of mangroves already before 1970, but it'll be, I believe, an important milestone because rather than continue to lose, now we're starting to rebuild. And there's most of the blue carbon projects now focus on mangroves. There are a few on seagrass and a few projects on salt marshes, but the largest coastal habitat of all is actually seaweed of algal forest. So algal forests have been largely ignored in blue carbon, not because we didn't think they were not important, but because at the time I co-authored the blue carbon report, then we felt we didn't have enough knowledge and information to be able to make an assessment of the contribution of seaweed to blue carbon and to nature-based solutions to climate change. So we then addressed this in a subsequent paper where we call a sequestration of carbon by seaweed as the elephant in the blue carbon room. And indeed, seaweed forests are very important, and we published recently, this is 2022, the first estimate of the global abundance of algal forest in the world. And it's kind of surprising that we didn't have these estimates earlier, but unfortunately, algal forests did not receive much attention also globally in the past. And then here we report that algal forests globally are actually a hidden oceanic Amazonia, because they are equivalent in area and equivalent in global production to the Amazonia, but rather than be a compact object in a particular region, they represent a ribbon of green and brown and red that grows along the shores of all continents. But again, 7.2 million square kilometers is about the size of the Amazonian forest, and 1.3 petagrams of carbon per year of net primary production is about equivalent to the Amazon. So certainly algal forests are important, and they need to be included in blue carbon strategies. So we also published subsequently work where we calculated that the carbon produced by this algal forest contributes significantly to carbon sequestration. And then we calculated that these algal forests contribute about 173 teragrams of carbon. That will be about half a gigaton of carbon dioxide sequestered in the deep sea. And we use genomic analysis to demonstrate that this algal carbon is present everywhere in the ocean down to 5,000 meters of depth in distances greater than 1,000 kilometers from continents. So they're really very important, and their carbon sequestration contribution is similar and as important as that of mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass combined. So they need to be addressed as well. And most importantly, seaweed is not just a wild ecosystem, but it can actually be grown and can be managed. So seaweed aquaculture is a new enterprise in the Western world, except Chile, where indigenous people traditionally consume seaweed. But in the Western world, there's a feeling that the Western world has discovered seaweed, whereas they're part of your culture for millennia. My colleague Atsushi Watanabe told me once that the first legal system in Japan that regulates the concession of ocean space to grow seaweed dates from the 7th century. So there's been seaweed farming for many, many centuries in Japan, in China, in Korea, but the Western world is now realizing that this is an important source of food and other materials, and also can play an important role in carbon sequestration. So the growth of seaweed aquaculture is very rapid. It's about 8% per year globally, and 95% of the area is in Asia. But the total area of seaweed farms is only about 2,000 square kilometers. So this is tiny compared to the area of land that we have co-opted for food production systems, which is about 50 million square kilometers. So the potential production of seaweed in the ocean is still in its infancy, and then we project that at different levels of future growth, and we believe that the growth of seaweed farming will accelerate because they are not only a source of food, but also a source of very important materials, e-fuels, high-value molecules, and other important materials that is now placing a lot of interest on seaweed farming. Then we can probably reach about 3.5 million square kilometers. That will be the area of seaweed farming in the ocean that can be achieved without negative impacts on the ocean ecosystem. In fact, with positive impacts on the ocean ecosystem. So this area will sequester about 1.6 to 3 gigaton carbon, which will be about 5 to 10 gigatons carbon dioxide per year, so a very important potential contribution to climate action. And then beyond this area, then these cultures might start to compete with natural ecosystems for nutrients, and also may compete with these ecosystems for light. But still, there's a more than 2,000-fold scope for growth in the global area of seaweed. So when we published this paper, we did not have any direct estimates of carbon sequestration in the soils below seaweed farms, but we published last year a paper where we established a network of 21 seaweed farms around the world in different continents and different countries that were sampled in a coordinated way to calculate the amount of carbon sequestered in the soils below the seaweed farms. It's important to note that none of these seaweed farms were ever designed to sequester carbon. They were designed to increase the yield of seaweed and other reasons, but they were never designed to maximize carbon sequestration. They range in size from very small in Western nations, like in the US, Canada, or France or Denmark, where the farms are only 1 to 2 hectares, to very large farms in China. And the largest seaweed farm in China is about 150,000 hectares in size that you can actually see from space. And they also range significantly in age. So the European farms and the US farms are only a few years old, but the oldest farm that was sampled in Tokyo Bay by our colleagues in Japan has been in continuous operation for 350 years. And it has accumulated huge amounts of carbon in meters of soils over this time. These farms, 21 farms, they probably represent about 10% of the global seaweed yield, and they employ about 27,000 farmers, and 70% of them are women, and particularly in farms in Africa and Southeast Asia. The role of women as seaweed farmers has been very important in empowering in their communities and raising their role in their communities and the household. So we published these results this year, and we found that the carbon burial below seaweed farms is actually equivalent towards the low end, but equivalent to the carbon sequestration that you can document in seagrass and salt marshes. So these are scalable blue carbon ecosystems that need to be contribute, and this paper was then highlighted in the journal Nature in their weekly news section as an important highlight of the week. So in fact, there's one system in the world, one blue carbon program in the world that already includes seaweed, which is the Japanese blue carbon program that issues, is an internal blue carbon program that operates within the boundaries of Japan. So no carbon credits flow across the boundaries. And the carbon credits are called J-Blue bonds. So they were designed by my colleagues in the room, and is considered to be the model system for the world. And it's also the model where the carbon credits are paid at the highest price, not because the carbon is more valuable, but because the investments that are being made in these carbon credits contribute to Satuomi, which I highlighted in my speech yesterday, which is a concept that initially operated on land but extends in ocean, and is the commitment of Japanese people to continue to invest in nature, to maintain nature productive and healthy. So it's not just about the carbon, it's about restoring your own ecosystems and maintaining your own ecosystems healthy and vibrant. And in fact, Japan was brave enough to be the first nation in the world that submitted in the 2024 assessment seaweed carbon as part of the nationally determined contributions in terms of climate action. There's been no other nation that has included seaweed in their submissions to the UN Framework Climate Change on Carbon Accounting. So I'm looking forward hearing what is the outcome of the review of the work. But many other Asian nations like China, South Korea, and others are looking to follow the example in Japan and include seaweed also in the family of climate action initiatives. And in fact, seaweed is not just a component of carbon removal or a component of food. So just for those in the room that are not Japanese, Japanese consume about 5 grams of fresh weight of seaweed daily in their diet, and that's about 150 to 200 times the average intake of people outside Japan, so particularly in the Western world. And the consumption of seaweed in Japan is not independent of Japan having the longest life expectancy, also very good physical condition in general when you reach old ages. And also I recently found that there was also evidence that the consumption of seaweed actually protects against Alzheimer's. So it is not just a source of food, but it's a food that carries particular benefits in terms of health, but it's also healthy for the ocean. So I'm working now on a concept called blue superfoods, which are foods that are from ocean that are healthy for us, healthy for the ocean and affordable for all. And seaweed stands as the epitome of blue superfoods. because in the ocean, seaweed contribute to climate regulation, but they also enhance biodiversity. That's very well documented, that seaweed farming creates habitat for marine organisms. It also injects oxygen in the water, which is one of the drivers of loss of biodiversity elsewhere, loss of oxygen. So they are a source of oxygen to maintain ecosystems healthy. And they also, by removing carbon dioxide, they're able to counterbalance an impact of excess carbon dioxide in the ocean that is called ocean acidification, by which the pH of the ocean is slowly coming down, and that affects the capacity of calcifying animals like mollusks and other to be able to produce carbonate. So they actually perform a number of important functions in the ocean. They also improve water quality, but then once they're harvested, then you can do wonderful things with seaweed. So the best approach to manage seaweed is called biorefinery. So it's a sequential extraction of high-value chemicals, and then you extract high-value molecules like vitamins and others that can be used in nutraceuticals or pharmaceutical uses. Then you put aside some seaweed for food, but you continue to extract materials for polymers. And there's a lot of, basically now you can produce anything from seaweed that you can produce from petrochemicals in terms of plastics. So we can displace single-use plastics with seaweed-based materials, but then we can also produce e-fuels from seaweed, and the aviation sector is looking at seaweed farming as a potential source of e-fuels. And finally, any biomass that is left, you can produce biochars, and this biochar can be used to amend soils to increase their fertility, the capacity to retain moisture, and also sequester carbon. So it is indeed a win-win strategy that generates many benefits for the environment and society. And one of the elements of blue carbon that it's usually not sufficiently appreciated is the importance of blue carbon for coastal protection. So it's not just about carbon removal, but the benefits of restoring coastal habitats for coastal protection are huge. And in fact, it's not just due to the increase in storms and cyclones with climate change, but even these habitats, as exemplified in the case of the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, can defend the shorelines from tsunamis and other very high energy events that have nothing to do with climate change. So now we are in the second act. I'm working now no longer in blue carbon. I always thought that blue carbon was an intermediate stop towards something more important, which is natural capital. So we should abandon a carbon-centric approach to nature and think about the whole array of benefits that we receive from natural capital. And then blue carbon is important in this pathway because for the Western world at least, I am aware that the Japanese culture has a different relation with nature of taking and giving back. But in the Western culture, it's all about extracting, not giving back. So it's the first time that marine ecosystems generate income by protecting and restoring them rather than extracting from them. So for instance, a tuna swimming in the ocean has zero value for Western people and perhaps even Japanese unless you kill it and bring it to the market and sell it. Then it has a value, but only when you kill it. But healthy nature has no value in the ocean. For the first time, companies are willing to invest in coastal protection and conservation through blue carbon. So that's really changing the marine conservation from a cost proposition to an investment proposition. It also breaks through the tragedy of the commons, and I'll spend a few minutes explaining what this is. And it moves the concept of the ocean from terra nullius, that is how the ocean was decoded by the Roman legal code, the Justinian Code, from which all of the Western legal code emanates. So it was declared nobody's land. So now, rather than being nobody's land, is everybody's land, and everybody can invest in healthy ocean. And blue natural capital is a new asset class that is actually now a new emerging component of the ocean economy, and a concept that also bridges across our climate and biodiversity goals. So why it is important to go from blue carbon to blue natural capital? So as I mentioned, around the 6th century of our era, the Roman Empire, now in Constantinople, then produced and aggregated all of the laws into the first legal code that is called the Justinian Code. And all of the legal codes in the Western world emanate from the Justinian Code. So the Justinian Code declared the ocean terra nullis. That means it belongs to nobody. And then it also declared marine life as res nullis, which means nobody's property. And that also implies that anybody can take it, and the first one that takes it owns it. So that means that if you don't take fish, somebody else is going to come and take it, and therefore it becomes a common. And the commons are subject to what we call the tragedy of the commons, which are the assets that receive the least amount of production. So tragedy of the commons is a phenomenon that's been described in economics and ecology, in which common resources to which access is not regulated by formal rules or taxes or property tend to be depleted. For instance, the air is a common good, and that's why climate change has emerged, because if you own the air, you will not allow an industry to pollute it with carbon dioxide or other pollutants. But because it's everybody's common, everybody can pollute it, and there is no cost to doing that. Now we realize there is. But the oceans are also a common. And the tragedy of the commons was first formulated with this name, but somebody called Garrett Hardin in a paper published in Science in 1968. And that is the quote from that paper. But in fact, it was already described by Aristotle, that wrote that that which is common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care. Men pay most attention to what they own, and they care less for what is common. So that is the tragedy of the commons, and now we are reversing that tragedy by investing in oceans and making the oceans investable. So in the words of my friend James Sterling, which is the founder of the Peace Department, but is the son of the founder of Sterling Capital, natural capital is the new real estate. And now currently, by investing in blue carbon, you can actually expect to get similar rates of return as investing in real estate. And there's no inflation, at least not cyclical inflation, that resonates with other elements of inflation. And there's also a very long maturation. So it's very interesting for pension funds and other funds that invest in real estate. And this journey to natural capital, from destruction to recovery of natural capital, brings us back to nature. Not to nature, but in nature. Because in the Western world, we have had the hubris that we exist outside nature, and we do not depend on nature for our livelihoods. That is obviously wrong, and we need to learn from cultures such as the Japanese culture, where humans do not dominate nature, but live in harmony with nature, immersed in nature as part of a unity with nature. So we're coming back, reconciling our hubris in the Western world with your culture of living in harmony with nature, and empowering our coastal communities to practice satumi, promoting a sustainable and harmonious coexistence between people and marine environment through active conservation and restoration, through which we all contribute either physically or through investment made by the private sector. And I'd like to close by reflecting on what sustainability is, because I find that we are a bit confused in sustainability, because now we equate the concept of sustainability with these stamps, goals 1 to 17, but sustainability really means to use resources from the planet without compromising the access of future generations to those resources. So I was born in 1960. In fact, I found the same year as His Majesty the Emperor. And then since my birth, we have emitted 50% of the cumulative amounts of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. We have also depleted 50% of the abundance of life on land and oceans. And we have driven to extinction 50% of all species that have been documented to be extinct due to human action. So I cannot look at the eyes of my daughter or my grandson and tell them that I've been sustainable. The contract of sustainability has been broken. And it is our duty to repair nature before we can continue to discuss sustainability. So we need to move to a new paradigm that is of regeneration. So it's not about being less bad. It's actually about building back what we destroyed. And the concept of regenerative action now is embedded in many activities. In fact, I found that it started with architecture, with the concept of regenerative architectures, which are buildings that actually generate energy, generate water, purify water, and even generate food and support life. Then it was then extended to regenerative land planning and urban planning. So we have regenerative cities that produce resources rather than degrade nature. Then regenerative agriculture, regenerative aquaculture, regenerative buildings, regenerative sports. So now regenerative is becoming a driver of action, and I define regenerative action as any human enterprises that generates social capital, economical capital, natural capital, and cultural capital. So it's about rebuilding capital, not about depleting or extracting or predatory approaches to capital. And I like to conclude with a reference to the JapanPrize Foundation, because I have always looked at the JapanPrize Foundation as a reference by linking science and knowledge to peace and prosperity. So I believe those two elements, how science contributes to peace and prosperity, is far more important now than it has been in the past few decades, because we live in times where both peace and prosperity seem to be compromised. So the role of science to create knowledge and contribute to that knowledge to peace and prosperity is more important than ever. And I gave a talk 2 years ago where I was asked to reflect on the role of scientists in contributing to solving problems in society. And I highlighted the role of science in multilateralism. So science is multilateral by nature. We collaborate across the globe, regardless of nationalities, regardless of political systems, regardless of political views. We openly share knowledge. And we provide the evidence that is needed for multilateral policies, but also speak in support of diplomacy when multilateral approaches come under fire, whether by domestic and foreign actions. And this is one of the times where multilateralism seems to be under attack. Science is the best example that multilateralism benefits every citizen. But we need to step up in our action because, as I mentioned earlier, the extent of climate change that was projected to be reached by 2035, 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level, is already with us since June 2023. And the impacts that we are seeing in the world are devastating. So this refers to the first statement in the title of my talk, that tomorrow is today. And this is a quote from a repurposed quote from a speech by Martin Luther King, actually on the evening where the US decided to enter in the war in Vietnam. But I think really reflects a bit of the predicament that we are now and what the role of scientists should be in this current situation. So we are faced with the fact that tomorrow is today, and we are confronted with the fierce urgency of the now. So now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. Thank you very much.